When Judge Nathaniel Calloway, a successful black state judge, returns to his small hometown, he becomes the target of a racist sheriff who abuses his power to harass and humiliate him. What begins as subtle prejudice quickly escalates into an unlawful arrest, exposing deep-seated racism and corruption in the system. Nathaniel is forced to endure intimidation, threats, and public humiliation simply because of the color of his skin. As tensions rise, the sheriff's relentless campaign to silence him reveals the ugly reality of abuse of authority and racism in America. How far will this injustice go? David Parker adjusted the cuffs of his blazer. Glancing at his reflection in the polished window of the upscale restaurant inside, chatter hummed under the glow of chandeliers, and the faint clinking of silverware filled the air. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. His firm had just secured a multi-million-dollar merger deal, and his team insisted on toasting their success. David smiled as he stepped inside, his presence immediately drawing attention. At 6'2", he carried himself with quiet authority, his tailored navy suit and confident stride exuding success. But beneath that polished exterior was the memory of every door he'd fought to open, every room he'd been told he didn't belong in. "Parker!" A colleague waved him over to a table in the back. Laughter erupted as David joined the group, drinks already flowing. "Big night," someone said, clinking a glass against his. David nodded, feeling a flicker of pride. He'd spent months working on this deal. Long hours, constant setbacks, and now it was finally sealed. He allowed himself to relax, the tension he always carried easing slightly. But the calm didn't last long. A hushed voice murmured behind him, followed by a cold stare that brushed his back like ice. David's brow furrowed as he turned toward the restaurant entrance. 2 police officers had entered, their eyes scanning the room like predators looking for prey. He felt the hairs on his neck rise as one of the officers, a tall man with a square jaw and rigid stance, locked eyes with him. David's chest tightened. He knew that look. Before he could process what was happening, the officer started walking toward him, hand resting on his holster. The room seemed to shrink around David, the laughter and music fading into a dull hum. "Sir, I need you to come with us," the officer said, his voice sharp and cutting through the air. David blinked, his calm demeanor returning despite the storm building inside him. "Excuse me, what's the issue here?" The officer's gaze hardened. "Step outside now." "Hold on," David replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I'm in the middle of dinner with my colleagues. Can you explain what this is about?" "Someone reported suspicious activity," the officer replied, his tone offering no room for argument. He nodded toward the second officer, who moved to flank David's other side. A ripple of whispers spread through the restaurant. Eyes darted toward David, some wide with confusion, others sharp with suspicion. And in that moment, David realized exactly what was happening. "Suspicious activity?" David said, his voice lower now. "What exactly did I do that was suspicious?" The officer stepped closer, his bulk towering over David. "You can argue about it outside, don't make this harder than it needs to be." David glanced around the table. His colleagues were frozen, their faces pale and uncertain. One of them, a younger associate, stood as if to protest, but quickly sank back into his chair when the officer shot him a warning glance. David stood slowly, his hands visible and steady. He knew better than to argue with a man who already saw him as a problem to be handled. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "But fine, I'll cooperate. Let's go." As David walked toward the door, the weight of every eye in the restaurant bore down on him. Judgment, pity, fear. He ignored them all, focusing on steadying his breathing. The officers led him outside into the biting chill of the evening air. Red and blue lights flickered across his vision as a patrol car idled on the curb. "Face the car hands where I can see them," the tall officer ordered. David turned sharply, anger flashing in his dark eyes. "Now wait a minute. Don't argue," the second officer snapped, stepping forward aggressively. David's patience snapped. "This is harassment, I've done nothing wrong." "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," the first officer replied coolly. David scoffed. "A black man in a suit, that's all it takes?" Nathaniel Calloway adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal gray blazer, the soft hum of his vintage car's engine settling as he parked outside Millbrook Cafe, a modest diner tucked into the corner of Main Street. He smiled faintly as he turned off the ignition, the warmth of nostalgia settling over him. The small-town cafe, with its creaking wooden door and flickering neon sign, had barely changed since his childhood. Even after decades of success, Nathaniel still preferred places like this over any five-star restaurant or private club. He opened the door, stepping onto the cracked asphalt parking lot. The crisp autumn air bit through his suit, rustling the trees that lined the narrow road. It was a simple town, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew your business. Millbrook had been his home, a place he left at 18 for college, vowing never to return. But here he was, years later, a man with power, wealth, and influence, a judge on the state circuit court, standing outside a diner that served the same coffee it had 30 years ago. Nathaniel wasn't flashy. Despite the headlines that sometimes mentioned him, Judge Calloway hands down landmark ruling, the voice of fair justice, he preferred simplicity. He still lived in a modest craftsman house and still drove the same car he'd restored himself as a teenager, a vintage Chevy Impala, its midnight blue paint immaculate. To him, success wasn't about the appearance, it was about the work, and leaving doors open for others like him to walk through. Millbrook, however, hadn't changed. Not really. Beneath its picturesque charm lay the same quiet prejudices, whispered suspicions, and reluctant nods of recognition. It was easy to remember why he'd left. As Nathaniel stepped inside, the cafe bell chimed softly. Heads turned briefly, then turned back, except for one or two stares that lingered just a beat too long. The morning crowd was mostly older men, in faded flannel and worn caps, seated in booths, and gathered around the barista counter, sipping black coffee, and murmuring about the weather and the latest town gossip. Nathaniel could feel their gazes tick over him. His polished shoes, his tailored suit. He wasn't one of them, not anymore. A younger waitress, maybe 19, approached with a friendly smile that faltered only slightly when she took in his appearance. "Morning, sir," she said, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "Table for one?" Nathaniel nodded with a polite smile. "Yes, please." She led him to a small table near the window, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. Nathaniel settled into the chair, the diner chair creaking slightly beneath his weight. He glanced around, taking in the familiar sights, the framed photos of fishing tournaments on the wall, the specials board that hadn't changed in years. A place like this was unchanging, and that was both its charm and its curse. "Can I get you a coffee to start?" the waitress asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Yes, thank you," Nathaniel replied warmly, handing her the menu. "Black." As she walked off, Nathaniel stared out the window. Across the street, the town's courthouse loomed, an austere red brick building with white columns that seemed out of place in such a sleepy town. It was the kind of building where decisions were made that changed people's lives, yet most never gave it a second thought. For Nathaniel, it had been a battlefield, a place where he'd argued his first pro bono case fresh out of law school, a young black attorney standing alone in a room full of skeptics. He'd won that case, against all odds, and he'd never forgotten how hard he'd had to fight for it. The chime above the cafe door rang again, pulling Nathaniel's attention. He glanced up just as two men entered, both white, dressed in sheriff's uniforms. One was a wiry young deputy, no older than 25, with close-cropped blonde hair. The other was Sheriff Dalton, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s, with a thick mustache, and the kind of stare that could unsettle even the most confident. Nathaniel recognized him immediately. Millbrook hadn't changed much, and neither had its authority figures. Sheriff Dalton's eyes flickered across the room before landing on Nathaniel. There was a beat, a split second, where Nathaniel saw the recognition dawn, followed by something harder to place. Disdain, suspicion. Nathaniel couldn't be sure he wasn't a stranger to looks like that. Dalton turned to the counter and ordered 2 coffees to go, his voice a gruff rumble that carried easily through the small cafe. The deputy, meanwhile, turned to look at Nathaniel more openly, his gaze lingering for just a second too long. Nathaniel ignored them. He wasn't here for them. When the waitress returned with his coffee, she placed the cup down quickly, her hands shaking slightly. "Anything else, sir?" "No, just the coffee for now," Nathaniel said gently, giving her an easy smile to calm her nerves. She nodded and darted away, clearly relieved. Nathaniel took a sip, savoring the bitter warmth. He didn't need anything fancy. No lattes, no cappuccinos, just black coffee. Simple. But as he drank, he could feel the tension slowly thickening around him like an unseen fog. Sheriff Dalton had turned now. Leaning an elbow against the counter, as he spoke to the deputy, Nathaniel caught snatches of conversation, something about strangers in town and keeping an eye out. It wasn't subtle. Nathaniel felt the weight of Dalton's gaze on him again, deliberate and slow, as if taking stock of him. Nathaniel let out a soft breath and set his cup down with careful precision. Here it comes, he thought. Sure enough, Sheriff Dalton pushed himself off the counter, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he approached Nathaniel's table. The younger deputy followed closely behind, his posture rigid, like a student eager to please his teacher. "Morning," Dalton said, his voice smooth but laced with something sharper. He stopped just short of Nathaniel's table, looking down at him. "Haven't seen you around here before." Nathaniel looked up, his expression calm and composed. "Good morning, Sheriff Dalton. It's been a while, but I'm not a stranger to Millbrook." Dalton's mustache twitched as he registered Nathaniel's deep, even tone. "Is that right, mind, if I ask your business here?" Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. There it was, that subtle challenge, wrapped in a thin veil of politeness. He was no fool. He'd encountered it his entire life. Some people wore their suspicions on their faces like a badge. "I don't mind at all," Nathaniel replied, his voice steady. "I'm here visiting family, hadn't been back in years. Thought I'd stop by for some breakfast." Dalton stared at him, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. The deputy shifted on his feet, looking between the two men. "You don't look familiar," Dalton said, his tone implying something more. "What's your name?" "Nathaniel Calloway," he said simply. Something flashed across Dalton's face, a brief moment of surprise, quickly masked by a neutral expression. Nathaniel knew exactly what the sheriff was thinking. Calloway wasn't a name easily forgotten in Millbrook, especially when it belonged to the black kid who'd left town and made something of himself. "Judge Calloway," the deputy blurted, his voice edged with surprise. Dalton shot him a sharp glance, silencing him. Nathaniel gave a small, measured nod. "That's correct." Dalton paused, his lips tightening. For a moment, the silence was palpable. Around them, the cafe had quieted slightly, conversations tapering off as people strained to listen. Nathaniel could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on him. "Well," Dalton said finally, his voice gruff, "I suppose you're free to enjoy your coffee, Judge Calloway." "Thank you, Sheriff," Nathaniel replied, his tone polite but pointed. Dalton lingered for a beat longer, his gaze lingering on Nathaniel's suit, his watch, his composed posture. Finally, he turned to the deputy. "Let's go. We've got work to do." The two men walked toward the door, the bell chiming softly as they left. Nathaniel watched them go, his face calm, though his thoughts churned beneath the surface. It was always the same. Even when you earned respect, there were always those who believed you had to prove yourself again and again. Nathaniel took another sip of his coffee, his hand steady. Whatever tension had passed was nothing new to him. He was used to being underestimated, questioned, and quietly judged. But this time felt different. This time, something was coming. Nathaniel took a deep breath, forcing the tension in his shoulders to ease. "Let it go," he told himself, staring at the swirling steam rising from his coffee. Dalton's challenge still hung in the air like smoke. But Nathaniel had learned long ago not to let men like him steal his composure. The door chimed again. A middle-aged man entered, flannel shirt half tucked into jeans, with a wide grin for the waitress behind the counter. "Morning, Anna Usual," he called. Anna, the waitress, smiled warmly at him, as though the earlier nerves she'd shown around Nathaniel had vanished. Different rules, different faces. Nathaniel sipped his coffee, observing quietly. This was Millbrook. A place where change arrived reluctantly, like an uninvited guest. He had nearly convinced himself to finish his coffee and leave, when a heavy thud against the glass window startled him. Outside, Sheriff Dalton leaned casually against his patrol car, arms folded across his chest, staring right at him. The young deputy stood nearby, speaking into a radio. Whatever they were discussing, it felt like Nathaniel's name was part of it. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his frustration carefully contained. He glanced around the cafe. People had noticed Dalton outside, but most avoided looking at Nathaniel directly. He could feel their unease, though, like an invisible ripple spreading across the room. Finally, deciding he'd had enough, Nathaniel stood, smoothed the front of his blazer, and left a crisp $20 bill on the table. He stepped out into the sharp autumn air, the bell above the door chiming faintly behind him. Dalton's gaze followed him like a hawk as he approached his car. "Is there something else I can help you with, Sheriff?" Nathaniel asked calmly, hands slipping into his pockets. Dalton straightened, his boots grinding on the asphalt. "Just doing my job, Judge Calloway. We keep an eye on anyone who doesn't seem like they belong." The words were casually delivered, but landed like a slap. "Doesn't belong." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't bite. "I wasn't aware sitting in a diner made me suspicious." Dalton shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching into a smug half-smile. "Depends on who's doing the sitting and why." Nathaniel held his gaze, unblinking. He knew Dalton was looking for a reaction, something to justify his suspicion, but Nathaniel wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "If this is harassment, Sheriff, I'll remind you that I'm well versed in the law," Nathaniel said coolly. "If you've got a real reason to stop me, by all means, do so. Otherwise, I'll be on my way." Dalton didn't move, his expression hardening. "Careful, Judge Calloway. People who get too comfortable start thinking rules don't apply to them. That's when they find themselves in trouble." Nathaniel's pulse quickened, but he smiled faintly. "And here I thought the law applied to everyone equally." Dalton's gaze darkened. "Watch yourself." The warning was clear. A thinly veiled threat, delivered in a town where a man like Dalton held far too much sway. Nathaniel gave him one last look, steady, unyielding, then turned toward his car. As he opened the door, he caught a murmur from the young deputy. "What's his problem?" Nathaniel didn't hear Dalton's response, but he didn't need to. He slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and gripped the wheel, forcing himself to breathe. His calm exterior hadn't cracked, but inside, frustration burned like a live wire. Nathaniel didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove the winding roads of Millbrook, needing time to think and distance from the morning's encounter. He knew better than to let men like Dalton get under his skin, but it wasn't easy. There was an exhaustion that came from always walking a tightrope. Measured, composed, proving yourself over and over again. The car's radio hummed softly, but he barely noticed the music Dalton's words replayed in his mind. "Doesn't belong." He turned onto a back road that led to his old neighborhood. The houses were smaller here, some with peeling paint and overgrown lawns, but it still felt familiar. He slowed as he approached a small brick home with a sagging porch. Mrs. Jenkins, his former neighbor, sat outside in a rocking chair, wrapped in a faded shawl. Nathaniel parked, stepped out, and waved. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins." She squinted at him before recognition lit her face. "Well, I'll be Nathaniel Calloway. Is that you?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied warmly, walking over to the porch. "I couldn't leave town without stopping by to see how you were doing." "You've grown so handsome and important," she said, her voice full of pride. "A judge, no less. Your mama would be so proud." Nathaniel smiled. Sitting on the edge of the porch steps, Mrs. Jenkins had been like family to him growing up, always ready with a plate of cornbread and a kind word when things got tough. They chatted for a while, the conversation easy and comforting. It wasn't until Mrs. Jenkins glanced toward the road that Nathaniel noticed the sheriff's patrol car cruising slowly past the house, Dalton again. Nathaniel's shoulders tensed as the car rolled by. Dalton didn't stop, but the sight of him felt deliberate. A reminder. Mrs. Jenkins clicked her tongue. "Some things never change in this town, do they?" Nathaniel turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her hands resting on her lap. "Men like Dalton have always been here. They see someone like you, successful, educated, and it rattles them, makes them feel small, so they try to remind you of your place." Nathaniel felt a knot tighten in his chest. "I thought things would be different now." "Different?" Mrs. Jenkins gave a hollow laugh. "On the surface, maybe, but underneath, it's the same Millbrook you left all those years ago." Nathaniel nodded slowly. the weight of her words settling over him. He looked toward the empty road where Dalton's car had disappeared. Whatever the sheriff was up to, it wasn't going to stop here. By the time Nathaniel headed back into town, it was well past noon. He'd planned to leave Millbrook today, but something told him he needed to stay. He stopped by a local hardware store, needing supplies for some repairs at his family's old house. Inside, the aisles were quiet, the smell of sawdust and paint hanging in the air. Nathaniel picked up what he needed and made his way to the counter. The store manager, a wiry man in his 50s, eyed him warily. "Afternoon. Find everything all right?" "Yes, thank you," Nathaniel replied evenly, placing the items on the counter. The man scanned them slowly, glancing up at Nathaniel as though trying to place him. "Don't believe I've seen you here before." "I grew up here," Nathaniel said simply. The man nodded, but didn't smile. "What brings you back?" "Family business." "That so?" The manager's tone had shifted, colder now. He rang up the last item and muttered, "Must be nice." Nathaniel arched a brow. "Excuse me?" "Coming back here, looking down at the rest of us," the man added, his voice just loud enough to sting. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I don't look down on anyone." The man didn't respond, simply bagged the items and shoved the bag toward him. "That'll be $40.50. Nathaniel handed over the cash, his hands steady, despite the simmering frustration rising in his chest. He said nothing more, collected his change, and walked out without another word. The small bell above the door clanged harshly, echoing in his ears. As he stepped outside, he paused on the sidewalk, staring at the bag in his hand. It wasn't just Dalton. It wasn't just the store manager. It was Millbrook, the town itself, clinging to a version of itself that Nathaniel had outgrown, one where men like him were meant to know their place. Nathaniel returned to his family's old house, the sun casting long shadows across the worn front porch. He sat on the steps, staring out at the empty street, his thoughts churning. He'd come back to Millbrook thinking he could reconnect, maybe find some peace. Instead, he'd been met with thinly veiled hostility, suspicion, and warnings that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Nathaniel frowned, but answered. "Hello?" A low voice crackled on the other end. "You don't belong here, Calloway. Maybe you should leave before something happens." The line went dead. Nathaniel's blood ran cold as he lowered the phone. It wasn't just hostility anymore. It was a threat. And he wasn't going anywhere. Nathaniel sat stiffly in the living room of his childhood home, the sunlight streaming through the dusty blinds cutting sharp lines across the worn coffee table. His phone sat on the armrest, screen black, but ominous. The voice from the earlier call echoed in his head. "You don't belong here. Maybe you should leave before something happens." He'd received anonymous threats before. Letters after rulings on high-profile cases, angry emails when justice didn't align with someone's version of fairness. But this felt different. Personal, local. Like Millbrook itself had sharpened its claws. As he sat there, he noticed something through the window. A patrol car parked at the end of the street. Dalton again. Nathaniel's lips pressed into a thin line as he rose and stepped to the window, parting the blinds with one finger. The car hadn't moved. The engine idling, Nathaniel could see the vague outline of a figure in the driver's seat, watching. He grabbed his coat, phone, and keys, his frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Enough was enough. He wasn't going to sit here like prey while Dalton tried to intimidate him. The air outside was sharp and cold, but Nathaniel didn't feel it as he walked down the sidewalk, his strides long and purposeful. He approached the parked patrol car, the sound of gravel crunching under his shoes, loud in the stillness of the street. Dalton rolled the window down as Nathaniel approached, his smirk firmly in place, the kind of smile that said he was enjoying every second of this game. "Afternoon, Judge Calloway," Dalton said, his voice carrying the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he was untouchable. "Is there a reason you're parked outside my house, Sheriff?" Nathaniel's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. "Just keeping an eye on things," Dalton replied, leaning an elbow on the door. "Small town like this, we don't see many visitors with your credentials." Nathaniel folded his arms across his chest. "Let's stop dancing around the truth, Dalton. You're harassing me, and it's going to stop now." Dalton's expression darkened slightly, but the smirk lingered. "I don't know what you mean. Judge, a man in my position has to make sure everything's above board. After all, we've had complaints." "Complaints?" Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "From who?" Dalton shrugged, his indifference carefully measured. "You know how it is, people notice things, strangers poking around where they don't belong." Nathaniel stepped closer, his presence towering. "I'm no stranger, Dalton. And this harassment, your thinly veiled intimidation, ends here. I'm done tolerating it." Dalton's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing into something colder, uglier. "Careful, Judge Calloway. You might think you're above it all, but you're just another man when you're here in Millbrook. You'd do well to remember that." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body screaming to respond, to fight, but he forced himself to remain composed. Dalton wanted him to lose his temper, to react. That's how men like him worked. "Enjoy the rest of your day, Sheriff," Nathaniel said tightly, turning back toward his house. As he walked away, Dalton's voice followed him like a shadow. "Oh, I will. You should watch yours, though a lot can go wrong in a place like this." That evening, Nathaniel decided to take one last drive around Millbrook to clear his head. The quiet streets, bathed in the orange glow of street lamps, seemed almost peaceful. He didn't want Dalton, or anyone else in this town, to think they'd rattled him. As he drove, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror, close, too close. At first, he brushed it off as coincidence, but the car didn't turn or pass him. It just followed. Nathaniel's pulse quickened, and his grip on the wheel tightened. He turned left onto a smaller road. The headlights followed. His chest rose and fell steadily as he pulled over in a gravel lot near an abandoned gas station. The other car followed suit, rolling to a stop behind him. Nathaniel turned off his engine, his movements careful. He watched in the mirror as two patrol officers stepped out of the car. One of them was Dalton. The other was the young deputy. Nathaniel rolled his window down, just as Dalton reached his door, flashlight in hand. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" Nathaniel asked, his tone measured. "You didn't signal back there," Dalton said casually, his flashlight shining directly into Nathaniel's face. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "A turn signal? You followed me for miles, and now you're stopping me over a signal?" Dalton smiled faintly. "Just doing my job. Now step out of the car." Nathaniel knew exactly where this was going, but refusing would only escalate the situation. He kept his movements deliberate and calm as he opened the door and stepped out. The young deputy stood back, his posture uneasy. Dalton, however, was relishing every second, his flashlight trained on Nathaniel's chest. "Hands where I can see them," Dalton ordered. Nathaniel held his hands out, palms open. "Sheriff, this is harassment, and you know it." "Harassment?" Dalton sneered. "We're conducting an investigation. Step back to the car." Nathaniel didn't move. "Investigation into what?" Dalton's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "A suspicious activity. Seems like you've been poking around town, making people nervous." "Or maybe it's just you who's nervous, Dalton," Nathaniel shot back, his voice calm but cutting. Dalton's expression darkened. Before Nathaniel could react, Dalton grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply. "Turn around. You're under arrest." "For what?" Nathaniel demanded, anger finally flaring in his chest. "Resisting an officer," Dalton snapped. Nathaniel felt the cold bite of handcuffs snap around his wrists as Dalton shoved him against the hood of his car. "This is illegal, Dalton," Nathaniel growled. "You're making a mistake." Dalton leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "The only mistake was you coming back here, Calloway." The station was small and dimly lit, the walls stained and cracked. Nathaniel sat on a wooden bench in a holding cell, his hands resting on his knees. Outside, he could hear Dalton laughing with someone, his voice carrying a smug, mocking tone. Nathaniel's mind raced. The arrest was baseless, he knew that. But it didn't matter. In Millbrook, men like Dalton didn't need evidence, they just needed power. He looked up as the young deputy, Mitchell he remembered, stepped hesitantly into the room. He lingered outside the cell, looking conflicted. "You don't have to be part of this," Nathaniel said quietly. Mitchell flinched. I'm just following orders." "Orders that you know are wrong," Nathaniel countered, his voice steady. "You saw what happened. You know this arrest is nothing but a show of power." Mitchell's face paled slightly. He glanced back toward the main office, where Dalton's voice still rang out. "Look, I don't want trouble." "And neither do I," Nathaniel interrupted. "But this is trouble, and you're part of it, unless you choose to step up." Mitchell looked down, his shoulders tense. "I'll see what I can do," he muttered, before disappearing down the hallway. Nathaniel leaned back against the cold wall, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He wouldn't let this break him. Dalton had underestimated him. Whatever the sheriff was playing at, he'd made one mistake. He'd pushed Nathaniel too far. Hours passed before the clatter of keys jolted Nathaniel upright. The door creaked open, and Dalton stepped inside. A smug grin plastered across his face. "Looks like you'll be spending the night," Dalton said, his tone light but dripping with malice. Nathaniel rose slowly, his gaze steady. "You think this ends here?" Dalton tilted his head. "Oh, I know it doesn't." "Good," Nathaniel said sharply. "Because I'm not backing down." Dalton's smile faltered for the first time. Nathaniel held his gaze, unflinching. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nathaniel stared at his phone, the chilling words still ringing in his ears. "You don't belong here, Calloway. Maybe you should leave before something happens." He tightened his grip, knuckles whitening around the device, but his expression remained controlled, hardened even. Threats weren't new to him. As a judge, he'd seen people lash out when they felt cornered or powerless. But this was different. This was personal, and it wasn't coming from someone hidden in shadows. It was coming from Millbrook itself, a town that had seen his face as a child and now refused to accept him as a man. Nathaniel stood, his footsteps deliberate as he entered the house. The old place had its creaks and quirks, memories etched into every corner. He found a seat at the dining room table, pulling out a legal pad from his bag. He'd kept notes all day. Dalton's harassment, the store manager's hostility, and now the anonymous call. If they thought they could intimidate him into leaving, they didn't know who they were dealing with. The sound of gravel crunching outside pulled him from his thoughts. Nathaniel stood, glancing out the window to see 2 patrol cars parked on the cracked driveway. His stomach dropped, but he kept his composure as 4 officers emerged, one of them unmistakably Sheriff Dalton. He opened the door as they reached the porch, his face a mask of calm authority. "Afternoon, Sheriff. Is there something I can help you with?" Dalton's expression was smug, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Just need to ask you a few questions, Judge Calloway." Nathaniel frowned. "Questions about what?" Dalton stepped closer, his tone shifting to something sharper. "We received a report of suspicious activity at this property, unfamiliar vehicles, strange phone calls. You understand, we have to investigate." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Suspicious activity. He knew exactly what this was, another attempt to unsettle him. "This is my family's home, Sheriff. I don't see how my presence here could be considered suspicious." "Well, we've got neighbors calling in concerns," Dalton replied, his eyes narrowing. "Said they saw someone matching your description sneaking around the property late last night." Nathaniel's brow lifted. "That's a blatant lie, and you know it." Dalton ignored him. "Mind if we take a look inside standard procedure?" Nathaniel crossed his arms. "Do you have a warrant?" Dalton's smile thinned. "Do we need to make this difficult? Judge cooperation goes a long way." Nathaniel took a steadying breath, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He'd dealt with men like Dalton before, bullies hiding behind authority, but this was escalating. "I know my rights," Nathaniel said coolly. "Without a warrant or probable cause, you have no right to search this house. If you're done, I'd appreciate it if you left my property." Dalton took a step closer, his shadow stretching across Nathaniel's porch. "Is that how you want to play it, Calloway?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. "It's how the law works." Dalton stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before giving a small nod. "Suit yourself." He turned back to his deputies. "Let's go." Nathaniel watched as they retreated, their boots heavy on the wooden steps. But just as Dalton reached the bottom of the porch, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "You've got a lot of eyes on you, Judge Calloway," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Might be safer if you just moved on. The unspoken threat hung in the air. Long after Dalton left, Nathaniel spent the next few hours pacing the living room, his mind racing. Dalton wasn't just harassing him, he was trying to provoke him, to bait him into reacting, and Nathaniel knew how easily that could be turned against him. A black man defending himself, raising his voice. It wouldn't matter that he was a judge. They'd paint him as the problem. By evening, the house felt suffocating. Nathaniel grabbed his keys and headed out, deciding he needed fresh air. He drove into town, ending up at Millbrook Courthouse, the same building he'd stared at from the cafe that morning. Its looming presence was oddly comforting. He knew courtrooms. He understood them. It was inside those walls that truth mattered. Facts mattered. But outside the courthouse, the world wasn't so fair. He parked near the steps, leaning against the hood of his car as the town settled into the quiet of evening. Across the street, a liquor store's neon sign buzzed faintly. A few people loitered by the entrance, laughing and carrying bags under their arms. They cast glances his way, but Nathaniel ignored them. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet. Nathaniel turned to see a young man, Deputy Mitchell, the rookie who had been following Dalton around earlier, approaching, his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. "Judge Calloway," Mitchell said cautiously, stopping a few feet away. Nathaniel straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Deputy, what can I do for you?" Mitchell shifted nervously. I wanted to talk to you about earlier with the sheriff." Nathaniel crossed his arms. "I'm listening." Mitchell glanced around as if making sure no one was watching. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but I don't think this is right, the sheriff. I mean, he's been after you since the moment he heard you were back." Nathaniel studied him carefully. "And why's that?" Mitchell hesitated, clearly torn. "Millbrook's a small place, sir. You coming back, someone like you, it rattles folks. The sheriff thinks you're here to stir things up." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "I'm here to visit my family's home, deputy, nothing more." Mitchell nodded, his voice quiet. "I believe you, but the sheriff doesn't. He's got it in his head that you're trouble, and when he gets like this, he doesn't let up." Nathaniel's mind raced. He stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. "Are you saying Dalton plans to escalate this to frame me for something?" Mitchell avoided his gaze. "I'm saying you should be careful, Judge. That's all." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his pulse quickening. "Why are you telling me this?" Mitchell met his eyes then, guilt flickering in his expression. "Because it's not right. You don't deserve this." Nathaniel studied the young deputy, searching his face for deceit, but finding none. "Thank you for the warning," he said finally. "But I'm not going anywhere." Mitchell nodded grimly and walked off, disappearing into the growing darkness. Nathaniel sat in his car for a long time, staring at the courthouse steps, Deputy Mitchell's words replaying in his mind. He needed to act, to document everything that had happened so far. Every threat, every interaction. Men like Dalton counted on silence, on intimidation, keeping people like Nathaniel from fighting back. As he turned the ignition, headlights flared in his rearview mirror. He frowned, watching as a patrol car pulled up behind him, lights flashing. A knot formed in his stomach. Not again. He rolled down his window as a familiar figure approached Dalton. "Step out of the car," Dalton ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the wheel. "On what grounds, Sheriff?" Dalton's smirk was venomous. "We got a call, reports of someone matching your description involved in a break-in over on Oak Street. Step out of the car." Nathaniel's heart hammered in his chest. "That's absurd. I've been sitting here for—" "I said step out," Dalton barked, his hand drifting toward the baton on his belt. Nathaniel took a breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to give Dalton any excuse to escalate this further. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, his posture straight and unyielding. Dalton moved in close, his voice a low hiss. "I told you, Calloway. You don't belong here." Nathaniel held his ground, staring the sheriff down. "This is harassment." Dalton's mouth curled into a sneer. "Tell it to the judge." "Oh, wait. That's you, isn't it?" Before Nathaniel could respond, Dalton motioned to the deputy with him. "Cuff him." Nathaniel's pulse roared in his ears as cold steel snapped around his wrists. "This is illegal," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Dalton grinned. "No, Calloway. This is Millbrook." The patrol car's lights flashed red and blue against the courthouse walls as they led Nathaniel away. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Nathaniel's wrists as he sat in the back of the patrol car, his breathing controlled but shallow. The air inside was stifling, thick with the faint scent of vinyl and sweat. Outside, the courthouse loomed, its shadow stretching long in the glow of streetlights. It felt like a cruel irony, dragged from the steps of a place where justice was meant to reign. Dalton hadn't said much since cuffing him, but Nathaniel had seen the satisfaction on his face, the smirk of a man who thought he'd won. The patrol car pulled into the small police station behind the courthouse, where a lone floodlight bathed the parking lot in a harsh white glow. As the door opened, Dalton grabbed Nathaniel's arm, yanking him out roughly. Nathaniel stumbled, but caught himself, his jaw tightening as he straightened. "You're enjoying this, aren't you, Sheriff?" Nathaniel said coolly, staring him down. Dalton's eyes glittered as he leaned in, his voice low and venomous. "I warned you, Calloway men like you don't get to stroll back into my town and act like you run the place." Nathaniel didn't flinch, his calm demeanor infuriating Dalton. "Your town, I was born here, same as you. The difference is, I had to work twice as hard to leave and make something of myself, and that eats at you, doesn't it? Knowing you'll never be more than a small-town bully with a badge." Dalton's face turned scarlet, his composure cracking. He shoved Nathaniel forward, nearly making him stumble again. "Keep talking, Judge. It won't help you where you're going." Inside the station, the air was sterile and heavy, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. A single officer sat at the front desk, her expression shifting to unease when she saw Nathaniel being marched in. "Sheriff, what's going on?" she asked. "Processing a suspect," Dalton replied brusquely, steering Nathaniel toward an empty holding cell. The officer frowned. "What's he being charged with?" "Suspicion of a break-in," Dalton snapped, his grip tightening on Nathaniel's arm. "Don't question me." Nathaniel glanced at the officer, young, with sharp eyes that darted nervously between him and Dalton. Her name tag read, Mitchell. He recognized her resemblance immediately. Deputy Mitchell's sister? Nathaniel seized the moment. "Officer Mitchell, is it you might want to listen closely, because your sheriff here is about to violate a whole list of laws." Dalton sneered as he forced Nathaniel into the holding cell, the heavy bars clanging shut behind him. "You don't get to talk, Calloway." "Not anymore." Nathaniel turned, gripping the cold metal bars with cuffed hands. His voice was sharp and deliberate. "Sheriff, this is an unlawful arrest. You have no warrant, no evidence, and no probable cause. You're trying to frame me because of your own prejudice, and when the truth comes out, you'll regret this." Dalton stepped closer, the smugness returning. "Who's going to believe you, huh? Some big city judge making noise in a town where no one gives a damn about you. It's your word against mine." "That's where you're wrong," Nathaniel replied evenly, his voice like steel. "Because you've left a trail, you've harassed me all day, followed me, and made threats. You've got deputies like Mitchell who see right through you. And when this goes to court, because it will, you'll have to answer for every move you've made." Dalton's confidence flickered for a brief moment, but he masked it with a cold laugh. "You're not going anywhere, Calloway. You'll sit here long enough for people to forget about you." Nathaniel held his gaze, unblinking. "You think this is over? Men like you thrive on intimidation, but you made one mistake. You picked the wrong man to threaten." Dalton turned sharply, storming back toward the front desk as Officer Mitchell looked on, wide-eyed. Nathaniel watched the scene unfold, his mind racing. He needed a crack, something to exploit. "Mitchell," Dalton barked. "Get the paperwork started. I want him processed." Mitchell hesitated. "Sheriff, shouldn't we, verify the report first? I mean, the call—" "Are you questioning me?" Dalton snapped, turning on her. "No, sir," she replied quickly, though her voice quivered. Nathaniel seized his chance. "Officer Mitchell, listen to me," he called through the bars, his voice firm but calm. "You know this isn't right. If you let him do this, you're complicit. You know what he's doing, what he's trying to pull." "Quiet!" Dalton roared, spinning toward Nathaniel. Nathaniel ignored him. His eyes locked on Mitchell's, speaking directly to the doubt she was already feeling. "This is your chance to do the right thing. You can either help cover up his corruption or stand against it. You know the law, you took an oath to uphold it. Mitchell's expression wavered. She glanced nervously at Dalton, then back at Nathaniel. Don't listen to him, Dalton barked. Start the damn paperwork. Mitchell's hands hovered over the keyboard. Her face was pale, torn between fear and her conscience. Mitchell! Dalton's voice thundered, his face reddening with anger. I need to make a call, she said suddenly, standing up, just to confirm the report. Dalton's expression froze. You don't need to confirm anything, I gave you an order. I still need to verify, sir, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. It's procedure. Nathaniel saw the rage in Dalton's face. He was losing control. The sheriff took a threatening step toward her, lowering his voice. Don't test me, Mitchell. Nathaniel spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Are you threatening her now too, Dalton, in front of a witness? Dalton turned on him, his face contorted with fury. Shut your damn mouth. But Mitchell had already grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. Dispatch, this is Officer Mitchell at Millbrook Station. Can you confirm a break-in report on Oak Street earlier tonight? I need to double-check the details. Nathaniel watched as Dalton froze, the blood draining from his face. He realized then that Dalton had pushed too far, too fast. And now the cracks were starting to show. A beat passed, then another. Mitchell's face paled further as the answer came through the line. There was no report? Dalton lunged for the phone. Hang up that. Stop, Mitchell said, jerking back. She stared at him, realization dawning in her eyes. You lied. There was never any report, was there? Dalton's breathing turned ragged, his hands curling into fists. You don't understand. No, Mitchell said, her voice rising. I think I do. You arrested him for no reason. You're... Enough! Dalton exploded, spinning toward Nathaniel. His hand shot toward the baton on his belt. I'm done playing games with you. Nathaniel stepped back instinctively as Dalton approached the holding cell, fury written across every line of his face. You think you're untouchable? You think someone like you can come into my town and... That's enough, Sheriff? The voice wasn't Mitchell's, it was deeper. Commanding, Nathaniel turned to see Deputy Mitchell, the rookie from earlier, storming into the room. He stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the chaos, his sister clutching the phone, Dalton with his baton raised, and Nathaniel behind bars. Stand down, Sheriff, the deputy said, his voice shaking with both fear and authority. You've gone too far. Dalton turned on him, his face livid. You're siding with him. You're making a mistake. No, sir, the deputy replied firmly. You're the mistake. Dalton froze. For the first time, Nathaniel saw uncertainty crack the sheriff's hard exterior. The room fell silent, save for the low hum of fluorescent lights. Nathaniel stepped toward the bars, his voice calm but cutting. Sheriff, it's over. You've exposed yourself, there's no coming back from this. And when I walk out of here, you're going to face consequences for every law you've broken tonight. Dalton's chest heaved as he turned, his gaze flicking between Nathaniel, Officer Mitchell, and her brother. He opened his mouth as though to argue but found no words. Defeat settled into his shoulders. Deputy Mitchell crossed the room and unlocked the cell, the clang of metal echoing like a verdict. Are you all right, Judge Calloway? The deputy asked, his voice steady. Nathaniel stepped out, rolling his shoulders, his eyes never leaving Dalton's. I will be. Dalton stood there, small and silent, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. Nathaniel faced him one last time. You thought you could silence me, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But men like you only win when we let you, and I don't let bullies win. Nathaniel Calloway sat rigidly on the cold, hard bench in the holding cell, his cuffed hands resting on his knees. The room was silent, except for the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the faint hum of an air vent overhead. Time stretched thin, punctuated only by his slow, measured breathing. Every second spent here burned, not because of the humiliation, but because it was a stark reminder of why he'd left Millbrook in the first place. He knew what this was. A test, a trap, a line drawn in the dirt. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Dalton stepped inside, closing it behind him with deliberate calm. The sound echoed sharply in the cramped space. He walked to the center of the room, his heavy boots grinding against the concrete floor as he stopped just short of the bars. Nathaniel raised his gaze, meeting Dalton's cold, venomous stare. There was no pretense of politeness now. This was Dalton, unmasked. "Comfortable?" Dalton asked, his voice dripping with mockery as he crossed his arms. Nathaniel didn't flinch. "You're running out of time, Sheriff." Dalton snorted, his mustache twitching. Time's on my side, Calloway. Always has been. You see, I don't answer to you, or to anyone you think that suit, that judge's bench, makes you untouchable, but you're still you. And here men like you don't call the shots." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Is that what you tell yourself, that this is about me and not about you, about how small you feel when you see someone like me succeed?" Dalton's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a split second, Nathaniel saw something flicker, resentment, fear, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. "You don't belong here," Dalton said quietly, the venom back in his tone. "I've spent my life keeping this town in line. People respect me because they know I don't let outsiders run their mouths or stir up trouble. And what do? Come back here like you own the place, reminding people like me of their limits." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his voice a steady blade. "You mean reminding you that your power only holds up if no one challenges it, that your authority doesn't mean you get to trample on people's rights?" Dalton's face flushed crimson. He took a step closer to the bars, gripping them tightly with both hands. "You don't get it, do you, Calloway? You think you're special because you've got a degree and a title, but you're still just—" Nathaniel's voice cut through his words like ice. "Say it." Dalton froze. "Go ahead," Nathaniel pressed, his calm unshakable, his gaze unwavering. "Say what you've been choking on this whole time." Dalton stared at him, his breath heavy, his face a mask of rage barely contained. Nathaniel knew exactly what was happening here. Dalton wanted him to lose control. He wanted to strip away the calm, the dignity, and see Nathaniel reduced to the caricature he believed him to be. But Nathaniel wouldn't give him that. "You're pathetic," Nathaniel said quietly, his words landing like hammer strikes. "A scared little man hiding behind a badge and a gun because deep down, you'll never be more than this, you'll never leave Millbrook, you'll never outgrow it, and that eats at you, doesn't it?" Dalton's hands tightened around the bars, his knuckles white. "You shut your damn mouth." Nathaniel didn't move. "Or what you'll hit me, add assault to your list of crimes tonight. Go ahead, Dalton, prove everything I've said about you." The sheriff's nostrils flared, his breathing ragged, the control he prided himself on was cracking. This was a man who'd spent years bullying others into silence, but now he'd run up against someone who wouldn't bend. Dalton straightened abruptly, his mouth curling into a bitter smirk. "You think you're clever, don't you? But nobody's coming for you, Calloway. Nobody cares." Nathaniel's gaze hardened. "You're wrong." Dalton's smirk wavered. Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice calm but resonant. "You underestimated me, Sheriff. You thought you could silence me, but you made one fatal mistake. You got sloppy, and now the walls are closing in." Dalton opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment, the door to the holding area burst open. Officer Mitchell, the young deputy, appeared, looking breathless, his face flushed. "Sheriff!" Mitchell called, his voice urgent. Dalton turned sharply, his irritation clear. "What?" "We've got a problem," Mitchell said, his eyes darting to Nathaniel. "The state police are here." Dalton stiffened. "What?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "They're asking about Judge Calloway. Apparently, someone made a call, said there was a wrongful arrest. They're demanding to speak to you now." Nathaniel felt his chest swell with quiet vindication. He hadn't made that call, but he knew who had someone with enough courage to stand up against Dalton's corruption. Dalton turned back to Nathaniel, his face pale with fury. "You—" Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, his voice level. "I told you, Sheriff. Your time's up." The next few minutes were chaos. The sharp sound of boots echoed through the station as two state police officers entered, their expressions serious. One of them, a tall black man with close-cropped hair and a commanding presence, spoke with quiet authority. "Sheriff Dalton, we received credible reports of an unlawful detainment involving Judge Nathaniel Calloway," the officer said, his eyes narrowing. "We're here to review the situation." Dalton's mouth opened and closed, his face betraying his shock. This is a misunderstanding. We'll determine that. The officer cut him off sharply. Release Judge Calloway immediately. Nathaniel stood as Officer Mitchell moved toward the cell, unlocking it with a trembling hand. The clank of the bars swinging open echoed through the room. Nathaniel stepped out, his back straight, his gaze cutting through Dalton as though the sheriff were made of glass. "Sheriff," the state officer said, his tone dangerous, "you and I are going to have a long talk about tonight." Dalton stammered, his confidence shattered. This is an overreaction. That man is a state circuit court judge," the officer interrupted, his voice steel. "And from where I stand, you've just made a career-ending mistake." Nathaniel adjusted his blazer as he approached Dalton, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stood close enough to look him directly in the eyes. Dalton shrank back slightly, his shoulders stiff. "You thought you could bury me," Nathaniel said quietly, the calm in his voice carrying more weight than any shout. "But the thing about men like me, we've been fighting men like you our entire lives, and we don't quit." Dalton opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked smaller now, his authority hollow, his power shattered under the weight of his own arrogance. Nathaniel turned to Officer Mitchell, nodding once. "Thank you." Mitchell nodded back, his face full of both relief and something that looked like respect. "I'm sorry, Judge, I should have said something sooner." "You did the right thing," Nathaniel replied, his voice firm. "That's what matters." As Nathaniel stepped out of the police station into the cool night air, he felt a mixture of relief and simmering anger. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Dalton was just one man, but he represented something far bigger. A system that thrived on silence, intimidation, and unchecked power. Nathaniel glanced at his phone, the screen lighting up with calls from his colleagues and friends. News was spreading. He knew what came next. Reports, inquiries, lawsuits. Dalton wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. And yet, as Nathaniel stood under the vast, starless sky of Millbrook, the question loomed like a shadow in his mind. How many more like Dalton were out there, unchecked? This fight wasn't over. It never was. The next morning, Nathaniel sat in a conference room bathed in golden sunlight, his hands clasped on the table as he stared at the folders spread before him. Across from him sat two representatives from the state attorney general's office, one, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit, the other a younger assistant scribbling furiously on a legal pad. "The evidence against Sheriff Dalton is overwhelming," the woman said, flipping through the file. "Your detailed statement, combined with Officer Mitchell's testimony and dispatch records, paint a very clear picture. Dalton abused his power. Harassment, false imprisonment, and tampering with official reports." Nathaniel's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Satisfaction. "What happens now?" he asked. The woman leaned forward, her voice steady. "Sheriff Dalton will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately while we conduct a formal investigation. Given what we already have, I expect criminal charges to follow." Nathaniel nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. "And the department?" "The state will review the entire Millbrook Sheriff's Office," she replied. "Policies, leadership, staffing. Men like Dalton thrive because the systems around them let them. That stops here." Nathaniel leaned back slightly, a quiet breath escaping him. It was a start, one that felt long overdue. News of Dalton's suspension spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By noon, the story had hit the local news stations. Sheriff under investigation for misconduct and abuse of authority. Camera crews parked outside the courthouse, their lenses pointed at a town that had tried for so long to pretend it didn't have a problem. Nathaniel watched it all from a distance. Standing on the steps of his family home, he could see neighbors peering from behind curtains, hushed conversations spreading through the streets. The tension in the air was palpable. Confusion, anger, disbelief. For years, Dalton had been seen as untouchable, and now the truth of his corruption was undeniable. The younger Deputy Mitchell, who had found the courage to stand up, approached Nathaniel late that afternoon. His face was a mixture of relief and regret. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, Judge Calloway," Mitchell said quietly, "for not speaking up sooner." Nathaniel turned to him, his expression thoughtful. You did what you thought was safest. But remember this. Silence has a cost. When we don't challenge people like Dalton, we allow them to grow stronger. Mitchell nodded, his shoulders squaring. It won't happen again. Not under my watch. Nathaniel extended his hand, and Mitchell shook it firmly. It was a small moment, but one that mattered. Change had to start somewhere. Later that day, a crowd gathered outside the Millbrook courthouse. Reporters jostled for position as townspeople, some familiar faces, others Nathaniel had never seen, milled about, their expressions uncertain. Nathaniel, standing at the center, felt the weight of the moment as cameras turned toward him. He stepped up to the makeshift podium. Microphones from the local stations were angled at him, and he let the silence settle before he spoke. I returned to Millbrook to reconnect with my past, but what I found here was a reminder of why I left. Men like Sheriff Dalton have thrived in towns like this for generations. Not because they are strong, but because their power goes unchallenged. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some faces turning away, but others nodded. Nathaniel pressed on, his voice steady and clear. This is not just about one man's actions, it's about a culture, a system, that allows abuse and intimidation to fester. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. If Millbrook wants to change, it begins with all of you. He paused, scanning the crowd, his words cutting through the afternoon air. You deserve leaders who serve with integrity. You deserve systems that treat everyone with fairness and respect, and you deserve to live in a community where no one is afraid to stand up and speak the truth. A ripple of applause broke out. Nathaniel's words had landed. He could feel it in the energy around him. A shift, subtle but significant. He stepped away from the podium as a reporter called out, "Judge Calloway, what's next for you? Will you stay in Millbrook?" Nathaniel paused, looking out at the town that had shaped and scarred him. "For now, I'll keep doing what I've always done, fight for justice. Whether here or elsewhere, that doesn't change." Over the following weeks, the investigation into Sheriff Dalton unraveled a history of misconduct that stretched back years: false arrests, intimidation tactics, and misuse of funds. Each revelation added fuel to the fire. Dalton's allies tried to defend him, but the evidence was undeniable. His badge was revoked, and charges were formally filed. The Millbrook Sheriff's Office, now under state oversight, began reforms. Some deputies resigned, unable to accept the change. Others, like Mitchell, stayed, determined to rebuild trust in the community. Nathaniel watched it all unfold quietly, knowing this was only the beginning. One man's downfall wouldn't fix everything, but it sent a message, a reminder that justice didn't belong to the powerful. It belonged to everyone. On a cool autumn evening, Nathaniel stood on the porch of his family home, the setting sun painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The town was quieter now, as though it, too, was trying to figure out what came next. He sipped a cup of coffee, black, as always, and let his mind settle. The past few days had been a whirlwind, the kind that left scars no one could see. He'd won, yes, but at a cost. Millbrook would never look at him the same way again. "Thought I'd find you here?" Nathaniel turned to see Ava Martinez, an old friend from law school, walking up the porch steps. She was sharp as ever, her dark curls framing a face that had carried him through more late nights than he could count. "Ava," Nathaniel said with a faint smile, "to what do I owe this surprise?" "I saw the news," she replied, settling into the chair beside him. "Figured you might need a reminder of what you've accomplished." Nathaniel shook his head. "It's hard to feel triumphant. This wasn't a win, it was accountability." "And isn't that the point?" Ava said softly. "You didn't come here to fix everything, Nathaniel. You came here to stand up, to show people what's possible when you don't back down. And you did." Nathaniel let her words sink in, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. "I can't stay here," he admitted. "Millbrook still has work to do, but it's not my place to fix it." Ava nodded, understanding. Sometimes, a fight isn't about staying, it's about showing others how to stand. Nathaniel exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Maybe." The two sat in silence for a moment, the hum of crickets filling the air. Ava broke the quiet with a chuckle. "You know they're already talking about you back in the city, right? Judge Calloway takes on small-town corruption. You're going to be everyone's favorite headline." Nathaniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "I didn't do this for headlines." "No," Ava replied, her expression soft. "You did it because it was the right thing to do." Nathaniel turned back toward the quiet streets of Millbrook, his voice quiet, but resolute. "That's all I know how to do." 2 days later, Nathaniel packed his car, the Impala's trunk clicking shut with finality. As he turned to lock the door to his family's home, he noticed Mitchell, the deputy, standing at the edge of the driveway. "You're leaving?" Mitchell asked. Nathaniel nodded. "For now." Mitchell looked down, scuffing his boot against the gravel. "Things won't change overnight, but I'll do my part. I won't let it go back to how it was." Nathaniel placed a firm hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "Good, it starts with people like you." Mitchell nodded, a small spark of determination in his eyes. "Safe travels, Judge." As Nathaniel slid behind the wheel and pulled away, he watched Millbrook shrink in his rearview mirror. The road ahead stretched wide and open, full of possibility. He didn't know where it would take him next, but he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice never ended, and he was ready for whatever came next. Nathaniel Calloway drove down the winding highways leading away from Millbrook, the familiar hum of his vintage Impala a comfort in the silence. The sky stretched wide above him, painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town was now miles behind him, but its echoes still lingered in his mind. The crack of Dalton's voice, the clank of cell doors, and the quiet murmurs of a town finally beginning to reckon with its truth. Millbrook had tried to break him. It had tried to remind him of a time when he felt small, powerless, and voiceless. But this time, Nathaniel had been ready. The scars left by the experience were fresh, but he carried them with pride, not as wounds, but as reminders. The events in Millbrook were more than just a personal fight for Nathaniel. The arrest, the harassment, the veiled threats. It wasn't just about one corrupt sheriff's abuse of power. It was about what Sheriff Dalton represented. A system that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. Millbrook was not an outlier. There were thousands of Millbrooks across the country. Towns where prejudice simmered beneath the surface, poisoning communities in quiet ways that no one wanted to talk about. Nathaniel knew this. He'd spent his career in courtrooms, staring down injustice, wielding the law as his weapon. But Millbrook had shown him that the fight didn't just happen in cities or on grand stages. It happened everywhere, in the smallest corners, where silence allowed oppression to thrive. He thought about Deputy Mitchell and his sister, the young officers who had chosen to stand up when it mattered most. It reminded Nathaniel that progress often began with individuals, those who saw the cracks in the system and refused to look away. Mitchell's courage hadn't come easy, but it had mattered. One voice could make a difference, and Nathaniel had been that voice when Millbrook needed it most. As the Impala sped down the open road, Nathaniel reflected on what had changed within him. He was no stranger to challenges, but Millbrook had forced him to confront something deeper. For years, he'd avoided returning to the place where he'd grown up, where he'd felt invisible as a child and resented as a man. He'd buried the memories under layers of success, believing that moving forward meant leaving Millbrook behind. But the truth was different. You can't outrun your roots, they follow you, shape you, and eventually call you back to confront what you've left undone. Millbrook had been Nathaniel's crucible. It had tested his resolve, his composure, and his belief in justice. It had reminded him that his fight wasn't over, not for himself, not for others. And through it all, he'd found strength in his ability to endure, to hold his ground, and to demand accountability in the face of overwhelming resistance. As a judge, he'd spent his career behind the bench, holding others accountable. But Millbrook had reminded him that sometimes, accountability requires stepping out of the courtroom and standing on the front lines, where justice is harder to see, but even more important to pursue. Word of Sheriff Dalton's downfall spread quickly. It wasn't long before headlines in larger cities picked up the story. Small-town sheriff removed after unlawful arrest of state judge. Social media amplified the events, and suddenly Millbrook's name was known far beyond its borders. People talked about what had happened, the abuse of power, the silence that enabled it, and the courage it took to speak out. Nathaniel received countless messages and calls from people across the country, some sharing similar stories, others thanking him for standing up. A young law student wrote, "Your story reminded me why I'm studying law in the first place. It's to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." A retired teacher shared, "I grew up in a town like Millbrook, and I never thought change was possible. Thank you for proving me wrong." But for every message of support, there were those who pushed back. People accused him of stirring trouble, or making it about race. Nathaniel had heard it all before: a deflection, an attempt to downplay the truth. Change made people uncomfortable, and discomfort often gave way to denial. Still, the story had made its mark, a ripple had been set in motion. Other towns began to look more closely at their systems, their leaders, their silence. A local news station reported that Dalton's exposure is leading to similar investigations into law enforcement leadership across the state. Nathaniel knew one case couldn't dismantle an entire system, but it could shake the foundations. And sometimes, that was enough to begin. Back in his office at the courthouse weeks later, Nathaniel sat behind his desk, staring at a photo on the wall, his parents' small home in Millbrook, the one he'd fought to preserve. It reminded him of where he came from, the struggles his family endured, and why he'd chosen this path in the first place. A soft knock broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Ava, his longtime colleague and confidant, leaning against the doorframe with a stack of legal briefs in her hands. "You're quiet," she said, studying him. "Not like you." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About Millbrook?" He nodded. "It feels like there's always another fight waiting." Ava set the papers down and crossed her arms. "Because there is. That's the world we live in. But you know what I've always admired about you?" Nathaniel raised a brow. "What's that?" "You don't back down. You're like a damn rock, calm, steady, and impossible to move when it matters." Nathaniel chuckled softly, but her words settled something in him. "It doesn't feel like enough sometimes." "It never does," Ava said. "But you're not alone in this. Millbrook wasn't just about you, it was a wake-up call for them, for others watching, and for all of us who believe this fight is worth it." Nathaniel leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe all I know is I can't stop." "Good," Ava replied, smiling. "Because we need you out here." Nathaniel stepped out of his courthouse office later that evening, the sky bruised with streaks of dusk. He paused on the steps, watching people pass by, lawyers, defendants, clerks, janitors. They were all part of the same system, each playing their role, knowingly or not. He thought of Millbrook, of Dalton, of the silence that had festered there for so long. It would take time for the town to heal. Change would come slowly, stubbornly, and only if people like Mitchell, and others who dared to challenge the status quo, continued to stand up. Nathaniel couldn't fix everything. He wasn't naive enough to think one victory meant the war was over. But he also knew that progress starts with one person choosing to act. As he walked down the courthouse steps, a young black man in a crisp suit passed him, clutching a stack of legal books. Their eyes met briefly, and the man nodded in quiet respect before continuing on. Nathaniel smiled faintly, watching him disappear into the building. It reminded him of something his father had once told him. "The road is long, son, but every step forward matters." Nathaniel turned toward the street, his steps purposeful as he moved forward. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. Hope that his fight, Millbrook's fight, had made a difference. Hope that others would follow. And hope that no matter how long the road stretched ahead, he would always take the next step.